Thank you for joining us. I'm
Well,
excited to be here with you as we do a follow-up on Minnesota's adult use cannabis licensing. It's a major milestone for Minnesota and really the broader cannabis industry in general. So for those of you who haven't joined us before, I am Peter Prevost, Chief Executive Officer of Bridge West Consulting. I'm a CPA by trade, or as I like to say, a reformed CPA, because I haven't really done much traditional accounting work in recent years. I'll always be grateful to the profession, though, because it's how I got my start in the cannabis industry, especially the early days of 280E, when businesses were really struggling to find professionals who were competent in working with the IRS. Um, so that journey connected me with a lot of the early pioneers, Jim Marty in particular, who was the founder of Bridge West, and really all led me to where I am today in this joint venture with BGM. So Bridge West Consulting is the consulting arm of BGM. We were the first accounting firm in the U.S. to focus solely on the cannabis industry. The firm started in 2009 in Boulder, grew from one small office that only did taxes for marijuana companies to really what I would call a national leader in the marijuana accounting space in just 5 years. Shortly after that, we were acquired and partnered with BGM, which is a top Minnesota CPA firm. And so now we've got deep roots, deep expertise here in the state of Minnesota. Together with BGM and BWC, we're now serving about 600 cannabis companies across 30 states, and these are all different shapes and sizes. We've worked with every license holder active in Minnesota as well. And so today you're going to hear from our leadership team and two of my really good friends, Jacob Irving, who's our VP of Consulting, a seasoned attorney who focuses on cultivation and manufacturing, and then Ben Ogren, who's based on the West Coast. He's got over 15 years of industry experience, product distribution, business to business sales, and biomass brokering. As I said before, I'm a CPA background. I focus primarily on retail and manufacturing for non chewables, other goods. But look, we work together for a decade. We live and breathe this stuff every day, and we're here to help you succeed. Our goal today really is just to kind of demystify the remaining steps in the application process, highlight what you can be doing right now while you wait. We're going to share some strategic insights we've gathered from, a decade of doing this type of work across the country. I know this process can often feel like a lot of hurry up and wait, but trust me, every minute counts. There's plenty of things you can be doing right now to position yourself for success. Um, with that said, there are quite a few aspects of the Minnesota market that really excite me. First off, the small footprint of the existing medical operators. You've only got two companies set up today, and so the adult use space remains largely wide open. That's a major distinction from what we've seen in other states where, legacy medical operators typically dominate in the transition to rec, and they get an outsized share of the early market as a result. So in Minnesota, new entrants truly have a shot. And I think that all these factors together create a market that's more accessible, arguably more competitive for small to mid-sized businesses who are just kind of getting started out. And one of the tools I find most exciting in Minnesota available to small operators is the micro business license. It's intentionally designed for small companies. You can be on a path to vertical integration. So that's cultivation, manufacturing, and retail all under one license. It's, to me, an ideal entry point for entrepreneurs who want to start small but still have long-term growth potential. And again, the built-in flexibility of the micro, where you don't have to build everything today. You can build a sustainable model, you can manage the scale, and you'll have opportunity to expand as the market grows and as capital becomes more available, because that's truthfully the largest barrier we're seeing. So, another aspect of the Minnesota market that really excites me is the integration of consumable hemp-derived ingredients into the adult use supply chain. That's unique and forward-thinking, and you won't really find that in many states, especially on the front end. So that means our licensed manufacturers can use hemp-derived cannabinoids like Delta-9 in adult use products, as long as they meet the regulatory standards, et cetera. And to me, this is going to open up a lot of new possibilities for innovation, product development, lower production costs, and it's going to kind of help bridge the gap that we're seeing today between the existing hemp economy and the emerging marijuana industry. So I think it's a really smart way to support the local processors and, as I said, accelerate innovation while still having that regulatory oversight and consumer safety. So I think the decision to embrace this kind of dual path supply chain is a great example of like flexible, business-friendly policies that make Minnesota promising on paper. But the devil's always in the details. So with that, I want to dive in. I'm going to hand things over to Jacob, who's going to walk us through an update on the licensing process and what you need to know. Again, thanks to everyone for being here, and we're thrilled to kind of share this journey with you. So with that, I will definitely turn it over to Jacob.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Great intro. And yes, my name's Jacob Irving. I am kind of like Peter. I'm a recovering attorney from Louisiana, where I practiced law in Louisiana, and then I've spent really the bulk of my remaining time doing in-house compliance and then some operations for cultivation and manufacturing companies. So with that, we're going to kind of dive into the process from, as many of y'all just went through the lottery or just got your like preliminary approvals. We're going to go from the first email saying, hey, your application met the minimum standards, to what do you need to actually become operational. And as we're going to cover on, there's a couple big steps into that, and it can vary somewhat depending on what part of the supply chain you're trying to take over. So we're going to start very, very, very basically with just the first thing, just to make sure that no one misses any critical steps. So getting your first minimum notification email from the Minnesota Office of Cannabis Management means that you are a qualified applicant. But there are actually two steps you have to make to actually make that into a preliminary approval. Now, they're not hard, but just to make sure that no one overlooks it, you do have to get a background check for all true parties of interests. If you're wondering what a true party of interest is, put most simply, it's owners. Put more complicatedly, if you have a more complex ownership structure, there is an exact definition in Chapter 342, Section 185 of the Minnesota statutes, if you need to look at that. It can include, for instance, unlike an LLC, if you have a C Corp, it can include officers. In certain instances, it can include people who have control over the entity. So, you're going to want to make sure you have that down. Those would have all been, theoretically identified in your original application material. So if you identified them, you need to make sure you've done a background check. There's a list of approved or preliminary, like third-party background check vendors on the Minnesota website. I personally use Third Degree, just A, because it was the first one on the list, and B, it was fairly straightforward. I think it was $54.99. So what wasn't a huge economic burden. But if you have any questions on that, again, there's going to be a background check on that. The other item that is required, unless you are a micro license, is going to be a labor peace agreement. Those are typically free to get. Teamsters is one Minnesota, a union operating in Minnesota. They've got a website and a link we can share with you if you're still in the need of that. And you can fill out an online form and take care of that. Again, pretty simple. That's essentially saying you won't interfere with like union activities at your place of business. And again, that is required unless you are a micro license. Once you have done those two steps, you will get a notification email that you have been preliminarily approved by the Minnesota OCM. And that's going to be significant because that's when your 18th month window to become operational without losing your preliminary approval actually begins. So from the date in which you get that email, you then have 18 months to actually begin becoming operational. And as we're going to cover on, there's going to be a series of steps that are involved in that, from, submitting update paperwork, securing your physical location. There's a lot of mini steps that can go into those big ticket items. So with that being said, I guess we're going to move on to what the next step is now, which is going to be, securing your real place of business, right? And piggybacking off of what Peter kind of said when he introed it, one of the things that that attracted me, at least, to wanting to operate in Minnesota was particularly for something like the micro license and the meso license. The rules are somewhat unique, for at least what I've seen, and that your business can take place at multiple locations. So while you can't, share one location with other licensees, if you are a licensee that has endorsements for multiple types of activity, such as a micro with a retail, a manufacturing, or a cultivation operation, you can conduct those activities in different locations. This can be significant because, as would be somewhat common sense, when retail, you want to be in a high traffic, high, person, commercial activity, that's typically going to be more expensive real estate. Whereas, when you're doing cultivation, you might want more land and a cheaper footprint, or more out of the way, so you can manufacture and cultivate without as much of the, regular, ordinary business activity all around you. So I thought that was fairly forward thinking for Minnesota. You've also, another little interesting nuance there was piggybacking off of what Peter said, was another market that hasn't really been divided up like it has in some other states, was Minnesota had very strict limitations on what I would call the adult use hemp market, or at least that's what we call it in Louisiana. So, in addition to manufacturers being able to use hemp-derived cannabinoids, there has not been the legal sale, I would say. I'm not going to say it doesn't exist, but the legal sale of things like THCA flower, and hemp vapes in Minnesota. So there's not going to be as much of that competition on the hemp side. All businesses that want to sell those products, because you can sell those products now, but you have to have the adult use cannabis license, and those go through the adult use cannabis system. The only exception being edibles and beverages, which can still go through the lower potency hemp retailer licenses. So that is also very different. Um, typically control over your property is something that's going to have to be demonstrated during this process. That's going to be typically a lease or a purchase. I have seen in some local options, local zonings for the local certificate, or particularly the retail registration, to let you use like an LOI or an option. Those are both good low cost options if they're available to you. Obviously, the game for this, and I'm sure this kind of goes without saying to the entrepreneurs on this, but you want to spend as little money on real estate until you actually have income coming off of it, right? So the best you can lock down your property with a lease date or a purchase date or an option date that you can trigger when you actually become operational, the better. Now, that's not always an option, depending on that's for you and your landlord. But if you have the option, that's obviously a cost saving measure there. One thing we really wanted to touch on here and is before you spend money on property, do your due diligence on the local zoning and retail registration. Minnesota is somewhat unique in compared to other states in that they have limited what local governments can actually impose. So for like cultivation, and we're going to touch on this a little bit more, but like for cultivation and manufacturing, it's time, place, manner restrictions and a very small other like cannabis specific things, mostly having to do with geographic distance from schools and daycares. For retail, though, they can do a cap, they can do a limit, they can do a special process. And so you definitely want to make sure you are aware of that, particularly if you're getting involved in retail. I mean, for instance, there are already, even this week, there are cities and municipalities and counties which are doing their lotteries, so to speak, on their application process for retail registration. So even though the first lottery just happened, the retail land is being carved up already. So that's definitely something you're going to want to look at, depending on where you want to locate. So I'm going to touch on this a little bit, and I think Ben's going to chime in here some too. But there are, in addition, the two things you really have to submit for as far as paperwork for the OCM is going to be like your business plan, your updated worksheets, and then your SOPs, standard operating procedures, for all the different worksheets and requirements we just did during the application process. One thing that is important to note about these worksheets and the process is during the initial round, you may recall that you had to check a box that said, I'm going to resubmit these. One of the big reasons for that was because the Minnesota OCM's rules were not finalized at that time. And so you did not get judged on the first round if your SOPs were not compliant with the rules because there were no rules. You will, however, have to now submit updated standard operating procedures which don't conflict with any of the Minnesota rules. So if you haven't read those rules that are now finalized, I think it's about 143 pages. You're definitely going to want to do that. There are definitely some differences too. If you looked at the draft rules versus the final rules, there are definitely some differences and allowances between those. So you're definitely going to want to be familiar with those. Obviously, as you're looking through the final rule document, if it's got a scratch through or a strike through on it, that's something that was in the original draft and it's not in the final draft. So you're definitely going to want to spend some time on that. SOPs that you are required to turn in are going to be like inventory control, quality assurance, accounting and tax compliant, and also your operations plans. And Ben can maybe touch on this a little bit more, but unlike in the preliminary process where you didn't really have, may not have a piece of property, may or may not have a fully vested plan, it is worth noting that for these operations plans, you will have to actually abide by them and actually do them. So like for your cultivation plan, you'll have to identify exactly what plot, what area, how it's going to work. And so you want to actually put forth your actual real plan and spend some real time on it, because otherwise you're going to have to submit an amendment or you might be out of compliance because, for instance, if you get inspected later and you're cultivating plants at anywhere that's not identified in your operations plan, that is a compliance strike. If you are manufacturing a product that is not identified in your operations plan for manufacturing, that's a compliance strike. So these are definitely real documents that you do really want to spend some time on. It's not really just a box check at this point in the game anymore. So
We've moved beyond templates.
It is one reason to keep them a little more simple though, like from an operational standpoint. Like a lot of people have like these large expansive plans, and sometimes we do recommend people just let's keep it simple to get the license framed up on the wall. After we have that relationship with our local regulator, we can start submitting additional SOPs for additional SKUs. Especially in the manufacturing space, it's best to just kind of plan one route through the facility, get approved on that, and then add excess. Same thing with cultivation. If you have several different plans on how and where you're going to cultivate, just kind of do the keep it simple, you know?
and that is one thing too. I do believe these operations plans have to be updated annually. So you think about what you want to do in the first year, right? And like for instance, one of the business models, and I'll use myself as an example, one of the areas that's attracted to me is I can be a micro processor manufacturer without having to cultivate and grow. I've worked at many farms. I don't want to be a farmer personally. I'm a law guy, right? So I'd be interested in pre rolls and vape pens. My ability to buy extra biomass might be more limited in my first year when cultivators are just getting started in the future. So I might, not have a built out operation plan in year one, but be prepared. But again, if you do plan on doing it, put it in there. So that is definitely just one of those things. I can move on now. I guess that's we'll put that on to the local zoning certificate.
Yeah, I would just touch on site plan a little bit. That is
Okay.
something that, just kind of planning out like, humans have elbows, and just kind of looking at like how people are going to walk through the facility, like how many square feet you assign to each one of these spaces. If you put a steel table somewhere, like there needs to be space for someone to stand in front of that steel table and someone to walk behind them. And I do personally see these things forgotten about quite frequently. And in some cases, hold up people's approval. There was a specific story about a hallway in a facility where, like, we all thought the hallway was level, seemed level.
Yeah, that's a great point too, and I could tell you some from my job having to like help people out with inspections. Sometimes I can tell you nothing makes a regulator more upset than because they have to physically come out there and walk your site as part of this inspection. And if you're
Mhm.
walking around cramped and uncomfortable, so is the guy giving you your licensing approval, and he will not be pleased about it. So it's and also this is a little bit of a tangent, but like especially for cultivation and stuff like that. A lot of inspectors use like RFID scanning guns to check your inventory compliance. That'd be like RFID tags, which is involved in metric, right? So if you've got a bunch of stuff right together, or you have your waste bin for your tags and some of that right together, you can throw off your own inventory just in the inspection part. So you do want to base a little bit, your SOP is getting those tags out of there, but also just be a little cognizant of operational flow when you design actually your site plan. And that site plan will also have to be submitted. Another thing that's worth touching on that actually, and while we're on the topic, is security. Obviously, because there are now specific rules. Like I mean, little things from like here's the FPS requirement of the cameras you have to have. Here are the definition. Here's how long the camera has to be active if the power goes down. How long does this battery backup have to be? All of those things now need to be part of your security plan. And like you need to work with the security contractor, vendor, planner, whatever it is. It's going to make sure that your security is compliant with those. Um, Having the right amount of alarms, the right type of alarms, the right amount of cameras, all that kind of stuff to make sure that if there is an issue, you will be prepared for that. Also in the
Well,
Minnesota OCM's workbook, it talks about in the inspection that they're going to email you inspection requirements. It doesn't really give a lot of details, but does talk about physical inspection. I would be shocked in my experience if security is not one of the top things they look at.
this does help with municipal approval too. Just like having these things under your arm when you talk to these people, being able to pass it across the table, and not just the SOPs, but also the business plan, the financial model, just like all of it in a nice, cute little binder, makes all these conversations go better, more smoothly. Landlords love seeing this kind of stuff. Occasionally you get in front of the fire department for one reason or another. They love to see these things. Um, and then unfortunately, just the world we live in, like having them prepared by a third party is just completely different than having them prepared by yourself, unfortunately. So
Yeah, investors might want to see it if you, depending on where you get your financing from. Also, it's just a good thing to have. Insurance companies love to see all that. I've done some insurance work for, and
yes.
like this is a great segue to our next point, but it's often overlooked, and particularly in a place like Minnesota, which doesn't have any like specific local control certain elements, but you do still have to be compliant with like local fire code things. And like those are simple things. If you've never like just opened a regular business before, right? Like having fire extinguishers in your office. Those fire extinguishers have to be inspected every so often. You have to have a minimum amount of fire extinguishers. You have to have a fire and safety exit plan. You have to have posted exit doors. All these various things can actually trip you up on getting your certificate of occupancy and have nothing really to do with cannabis, but just standard business stuff that can be overlooked. And then what I found, and I think Minnesota is going to be a little bit more friendly than some of the states I've worked in, like Mississippi, for instance. But sometimes you find a municipality who, like, on the letter of the law, is not allowed to stop you, but on the spirit of the law, would certainly love to not have your cannabis business there. And the more buttoned up you seem, the more compliant you are, both the more likely they are willing to be working with you, but also the less opportunity you give them to cause an issue for that. And that can particularly become important if you need to seek any type of zoning variance or get anything else approved at the municipal level, because those are all still theoretically applicable standards. They're just not cannabis specific. But like, let's say you're in an area that's M1, like a light industrial, and then that zoning area decides that they need to do heavy industrial, right? So now you need to get changed from just light industrial to heavy industrial. And then, that can be a hearing, an opportunity to be heard for the members of the public. That can be a lot of those different things. And again, if you have answers to questions people might have, that can obviously really help you.
We try to avoid zoning variances at all
I
costs.
would
Like, no matter
absolutely.
how well prepared you are, they're just it's a dice roll.
Yeah.
So
I mean, like, look,
It can take a really long time. I mean,
yeah. Well,
you don't know what you're getting into time-wise. It's hard to budget for that.
if you're starting from scratch, right? If you're starting from scratch and you don't already have his property, obviously my advice would be go find one that meets the rules exactly. Look at the local zoning ordinance for the area you're trying to look in. Check those zoning plots with your local department, see if there's any requirements. Measure your distance from your local school, daycare, and everything else. Because even if they haven't adopted something currently, will that change in the future? I would make sure I'm at least the state law minimum that they are allowed to impose, even if they haven't, away. And that'd be 1,000.
so I did it's just a fun story, but I did a project in Detroit. It was just like where I'm originally from, and we got medical marijuana in 2008, which our program was very much like a rec program. Either way, it was like I was the expert in the room, and it was actually a joke when I said it, but I was like, well, why don't we just cut the corner off the building? And the whole room was like, oh, great idea, we're gonna do that. And it worked. Actually, it was like had to remove 3 feet, and they took like a 5 foot corner off of this big manufacturing facility, and no one ever noticed.
Yeah, I mean, so you're going to want to review your local zoning thing. The only time you're going to want to get into like any kind of variances is, let's say you already had a piece of property, or you have a family property, or for some reason you're trying to make an already existent piece of property work. That's the time when you probably need to engage with a local zoning attorney who's registered and practices law in Minnesota and in your local area. And because
Plays golf with the mayor.
that's a significant undertaking. So, look, as far as the actual process goes, right, what you do is you submit your site plan to the OCM, and then they forward your application basically to the local government, and then the local government has 30 days to certify zoning compliance. I am sure this goes without saying, but please, please check your local government. In law, there's a big thing when you're cross-examining someone, like never ask a question you don't already know the answer to. When it comes to local zoning compliance, my first advice would be like, don't just cold send this to the local zoning office without having talked to them at all, right? Because then you're asking a question you don't know the answer to, and you don't know what they might say in that response. It'd be at worst at least a soft touch from them to make sure that they are there's not anything you're not seeing, to make sure your plot is legal for the intended use, and all those sorts of things.
What you can do is you can get what's called a zoning determination letter, right? So instead of you like Jacob said, don't ask questions you don't know the answer to. You've looked it up. You think you know what the zoning on this particular piece of property is, right? You've cross-referenced it. You talk to a real estate agent, et cetera, et cetera. You can then go to the city, county, whoever's in charge of the zoning there, and ask them for a copy of what's called the zoning determination letter. Usually, you can get that in a few days. And when you have that, it's going to tell you exactly what the city thinks it is too, and that way you can match that up with what you're looking for too. That's one building block of a step that you take before you turn this in. So
Yeah,
yes.
so
Unincorporated space can sometimes, like when you get out of the townships
Mhm.
and cities and you get into the unincorporated space, that can be a nice little cheat code. Those people are much easier to work with in general, you know.
And that brings back actually a really good point, because one of the things that they're allowed to do in zoning is basically delegate authority, right? So if you're in an unincorporated area or even in a city, you have to look at, because the city may have delegated authority for cannabis zoning to the county, or the county might be in charge of the unincorporated area, or the city might be in charge of the unincorporated area. So like you need to find first and foremost, like for instance, one city of Rochester actually is done by the county of Olmsted, just as an example, right? So you want to make sure you are aware of what jurisdiction is actually in charge of your property and that you're talking to the right jurisdiction. I will say one of the simpler ways to do this too is also they've been very friendly. I've gotten on the phone and called various different municipalities for clients. Typically, they're happy to point you in the right direction. So, but again, it's it's worth having that
A
that
little more friendly than New York and New Jersey, huh?
Very much so. I do love the people of Minnesota are typically a whole lot more friendly. Not that New Jersey and New York aren't; they're just a little bit more abrupt, I guess I would say. So, look, one thing I did want to read specifically, just so you have it, and another good thing to do on this zoning ordinance. There's a model zoning ordinance on the Minnesota OCM's website that they sent out to all the municipalities in Minnesota. That doesn't mean that they adopted it, right? But like it shows you in different languages. You'll see red, you'll see optional. So it kind of shows you what things to be looking at when you're looking for different properties and zoning. So that model ordinance is very much worth looking at for that reason. So one of the things that is optional for them to do that you're definitely going to want to check for is a local government may prohibit the operation of a cannabis business. Now, this is any cannabis business, not just retail, within 1,000 feet of a school, 500 feet of a daycare, residential treatment facility, or, and this is where it's going to get complicated, attraction within a public park that has regularly used by minors, including playgrounds or athletic fields. So that last one has a little bit more ambiguity to it. But this kind of comes into the same thing with what Peter was talking about with the zoning determination letter. If you have a question, don't just send it in and hope for the best. Find out, particularly, and I can't stress this enough, before you spend money on a property and then have to request some sort of
Yeah, work
zoning.
backwards. It's
Yeah.
kind of the opposite of a lot of places. I think or a lot of our clients and applicants, they're thinking that it'd be like a normal business where you kind of like you have this like dream facility that like checks all the boxes for you and like that's what you look for. Like a lot of times we find people work backwards from like the facilities they are able to find, and then we kind of build the business around them, you know. Minnesota's way more laissez-faire than some states, but still it's just that's the path of least resistance.
Yeah, and kind of concluding this section, and we're gonna talk a little bit more about these in another section. But again, like um, municipalities cannot outright prohibit cannabis business, just time, place, manner restrictions. They can set limits though on retail. I think it's no less than one per 12,500 residents. But that and they can do that by county and other kind of other stuff. The other area they really have a lot of control over, and it's not the focus of this, but it's worth mentioning. It's going to be event permits. So like cannabis event permits, they can outright deny a cannabis event permit. They can also outright deny public consumption at an event permit. So there's definitely something as it comes later on when you're looking at doing event permits, that might be something you want to look at. Also, if that's part of your business model, like let's say you're a retailer and part of my business model, I want to have events out there as a marketing advertising opportunity. You're going to want to check the temperature of that on the front end before you set up shop. And then a year from now, you try to have your first event and you realize that, they're like, not just no, but hell no.
Yeah, no, and I like just fun little story real quick too. I know of an example here in Seattle where somebody actually rented space, put together like a pretty basic little restaurant, and then put pinball machines in it specifically to keep a competitor from opening a dispensary next to his.
Yeah, I mean, like it's a wild world. And I'll read this example too, just to finalize the zoning thing, just because that this is actually pulled directly from the Minnesota OCM's model ordinance. So just, it basically says cannabis manufacturing facilities are often going to be industrial zones. Cannabis retailers are often commercial retail zones. That is the guidance that they're giving to the municipalities. So many of them will have, like I know St. Paul does, for instance, will have an overlay map on their website you can find, and it'll have it checked by like, all of these areas are good for cannabis retail, and all of these areas are good for manufacturing cultivation. So if you can find overlay maps, stuff like that, that obviously gives you a head start. Every single overlay map you'll probably ever look at will probably have a disclaimer somewhere that says this is for educational purposes only and shouldn't be used to be legally relied upon. So with that being said, this goes back to use the overlay map to start looking at real estate property. But again, before you, if it was me, I guess I would say, before I spent money on the property, if I had the opportunity during my due diligence process before I purchased the property, I would include things like the zoning determination letter and making sure it was fit for the intended use.
We do see people bleed on property for quite long periods of time, though. It's not like it's something you should try to avoid, but it's not abnormal for somebody to rent a space for a long period, and even maybe or they might run a different business in it for a year while they get all their ducks in a row.
And like it could be one of those things, right? So let's say like you have to have a lease to get ready, but like what if the Minnesota OCM can't make your inspection for a long period of time, right? And then you could end up paying your lease rent amount every month until the OCM just gets around to you. And then particularly if you're a retailer too, like let's say you're just doing retail, there might not be as much product available in the beginning, right? So you want to be strategic with when you start to incur some of these costs to the extent that you can. So once you get that zoning certificate, and they will only do this after you've actually submitted all the documents, right? So you submit all your documents in the Excel portal. That's the same portal you use to apply. You submit the site plan, then they'll send it out to the local registration. Then they'll get that registration back, presumably after 30 days. And then they'll actually schedule a physical site inspection to make sure you're compliant with state and local rules. They did not provide a lot of details on that inspection process, but things that I have typically seen will involve, security. Particularly if you're manufacturing, you're going to want like any engineering reports as far as extraction equipment, making sure you're compliant with local fire codes too. Like if you're doing ethanol or if you're doing, any type of extraction, using a substance, right? Making sure that that's in the proper like C1.
Do they need C1D2 for ethanol handling?
That's probably going to be a local determination. What I've seen is typically that C1D2 is what I have seen historically for ethanol, but that, again, that could vary. So I wouldn't, don't hold me to it. Always check, I also, they might do a walkthrough of some of your SOPs, particularly like, and it's little things too, like, making sure you have MSDS sheets for anything. That's material safety data sheets for anyone who might not be familiar, for any kind of solvents, cleaners, or other types of equipment you've done it. If you've got anything flammable, it's going to want to be stored in a flammables cabinet, pesticides.
There's two types of rooms that the regulators look for. There's like the C1D1 and then the C1D2. Depending on what people want, it's like the D1 is for explosive gases, environments where they expect explosive gas to be present. And then the C1D2 is environments where in a perfect environment, there would be no explosive gases, but it could happen. And so you see those used with ethanol is tricky because in chemistry literature, sometimes it's labeled as volatile, other times it's not. It depends. It's kind of one of those perspective things.
Yeah, you also, if you do have one of those rooms, this is going to be, again, for manufacturers, you're going to have special cameras and other kind of stuff. Those cameras can get pretty expensive, let me tell you, because all electronics, the kind of potential sparking hazards have to be specifically geared and engineered to be in that type of environment. Cameras is almost certainly going to be another thing they're looking for, making sure that all, like, let's say, critical activities are covered by video recording of appropriate qualification. That's critical activities are also going to be like things like growing, manufacturing, selling, but also like wasting and storing, are typically some of the bigger areas. So, they're going to want to make sure, I believe Minnesota also has a specific requirement for a vault access type of log. So recording who goes in and out of the actual vault or storage area is somewhat unique to Minnesota. I have seen that in other jurisdictions. We launched with that in Louisiana.
You mentioned waste. I would say, just like so people do hear this, I mean, the history in cannabis of extraction was really a waste management technique. It was a way of extracting the actives from the material and then being able to throw away the vegetable mass or whatever you want to call it. And then obviously we built whole economies around these products, but
Yeah. So once you've done some of the actually gotten through that, you're going to go through and pay your licensing fee. You've got an initial fee, which I guess is what would we do, and then there's an annual fee, and you know things moving perpetually. That also again gets paid through Excella. It's the same portal you've been doing with for the Minnesota OCM. The good news is for microbe licenses, that actual fee is nothing, so that's helpful. On the worksheet, I believe we gave out, then you know we've got a couple different of those fees. I'll cover some of the bigger ones. Mezzo, it's going to be $5,000. Retailer, it's going to be $2,500. Cultivator and manufacturers are very expensive, 20 and 10K. And then, you know, wholesaler is going to be 5,000, transporter 500, test facility 5,000, delivery 500, and medical combination business would be 20,000. I would be somewhat surprised. I'm waiting to see this happen, but if other businesses become a medical combination business other than the initial medical marijuana cultivators. And I say that because there are limitations in the rules as far as how much of your biomass you can actually, if you're a medical business, sell into the adult use market. So, you know, that's a pretty major limitation. And I don't know why you would necessarily want to break into the medical market, you know, with that limitation when you're not, if you're not already in the space. So yeah,
It'd be very difficult for a new cultivator to come in and get any shelf space in medical because they're vertically integrated. You've only got the two companies. I mean, I wouldn't, you know, if I were one of those two companies, I wouldn't carry a new.
yeah. I mean, yeah, you know, I don't know if there's something I'm missing there, but that's not
Yeah.
something I would do.
Do they get to open more? Do they get to open new medical retail?
Yeah, you could open your own medical you can be vertically integrated, so
Okay.
that's the upside, right? But like the licensing fees can be very expensive. I think it can go up to 75K, like which to
Which
me
is
that
like
makes
what you said, anytime, and this has happened in some states before, Colorado notoriously, it's like where you have to say ahead of time, okay, you're growing for dual purpose for medical and adult use, and you got to tag the plant up front with a metric tag for one of those pathways. It's really hard to do that and like not waste a bunch of material.
yeah, I
I'll
want
say
to
too that the medical programs tend to over time get sunsetted. Like in many of these like mature markets, they did away with them. You know, Colorado kept it, but
yeah, I mean often it could be like a tax difference. But like I want to say that it was something like 2/3 of your canopy space or something that had to be used for medical. So you're really looking at only 1/3 of your canopy space being adult use. So that's harsh right there. And there's another limit on processing on top of that. So like it's you know that's a lot. And I guess that's one thing we didn't talk about, but you know people are probably already familiar with that. But as you're probably already aware, micro and meso and everyone else actually has processing and cultivation limits. Like micro, I think it's 5,000 square feet of indoor, and then it's or a half acre outdoor. I believe it's a full acre outdoor or 15,000 square feet for a meso business and 3 retail stores, opposed to 1 for micro. And then I think it's 10,000 pounds annually for micro and maybe 30,000 for meso annually. One thing that is significant, two things that are actually significant is I've yet to see what they are going to say is the oil equivalent of 10 or 20,000 or 30,000
yeah,
pounds. So that language is in the state law. But like, for instance, let's say
it'll
you're
get argued though. People
yeah,
argue it.
let's say you're a business like I want to do, you know, and then I don't even want to extract. I want to just buy oil, right? And so like let's say I buy 5,000 grams of oil to make 10,000 vape pens. For the sake of argument, like how many quote unquote pounds for the purpose of the rules did I just process? Yeah, no, I'm yet to find a good answer for that. I'm sure that's something that the
My
OC.
argument, yeah, we'll dive into that. Like you said, it's an argument, right? Because you're processing. What was your processing
Yeah,
activity? You filled it into a device.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. I
you
mean,
know,
you know,
to me,
yeah.
it's a
I'd say
gram to
gram for
gram,
gram, gram for
gram for
gram.
gram. Legally is what I would argue in court. But anyway,
A
we'll get
lot
to
of people do argue it that way. And
yeah.
then the regulators often, I'll just say this, and this isn't a popular concept, but the regulators often, like, I've seen examples of people going over their caps and then nothing happens. You know, I'm not saying to plan your business around that, but, you know, it's important to note the regulator has to choose to write you an infraction.
Oh, sorry. I just saw some questions, and
Hmm.
so I'm going to go ahead and answer those. My apologies, I didn't see them sooner, but
Good. Yeah, I
so
don't even know that was going up. Sorry, I think I was supposed to.
yeah,
I
I
was
just
gonna wait till the end. I thought I'd wait till the end. I was like,
I'm
oh,
a
well,
big I come from the law background when you're used to getting grilled. So the first question is, do you know how long someone has to submit their background check and bona fide labor peace agreement to the state? I didn't see a deadline for that in the email. You are correct. I didn't see a deadline for it in the email either. I don't know. I am not aware of a hard deadline that exists for that. I was surprised when I looked into it, learned the 18-month window started from really getting that background check. I imagine that they would eventually send you something to the tune of, hey, you need to do this immediately. We could probably write them an email and ask, but like, if you haven't done it already, I wouldn't worry. You still definitely have time today. Also, you can do all of those in a couple of days. The background check took me maybe an hour. And like actually third degree only bills you on the first of a month. So if you did it today, you only have to pay them for 14 days. So, and then the labor
because this person could also be thinking about this in a different way, not like, oh gosh, am I late? But how long can I stretch this out? Because
if
your
that's a good question
18-month
too.
window hasn't started yet till you do that background check. This is a further delay tactic that you can be using if that's your strategy.
Right.
And I agree with you. We know that there's no legal limit in the law. I think eventually they're going to have to clean that up. They're going to
I agree.
they're going to have to put out a notice eventually and say, hey guys, deadline is here. I wouldn't think they could. I don't know. I mean, I guess they could do whatever they want, but they can also get sued again, like they tend to do. I mean, they could also say, "Hey, sorry, you missed the window." But since they haven't given notice, I don't think they would do that. I expect we're going to see some sort of announcement at some point in the future that says you have so many days to wrap this up. But some people could be using this as another delay tactic to get 20 months instead of 18.
Peter, do you know of a state that has not been sued through their application process?
Actually, well, let me not speak too soon.
That'd be a shorter list.
Technically, that doesn't count. I'm not going to touch that one right now because I don't want to cause a lawsuit that should have happened.
So anyway, the other question that was here was, can two mezzos run their grow under the same roof, providing that the space has multiple addresses? My gut answer to that would be no. There is a little bit of complications in that, and really that's going to be a fact and circumstances specific inquiry. There is a prohibition in the rules of multiple licenses sharing the same facility. What is and is not a facility, is going to be a very fact determinative effort.
Pretty.
I'd say I think it could be done, but it has to be real. It has to be real in concept. It can't just be like, oh, we're sharing like if you're really not co-located and you can really prove you're not co-located, two energy supplies, two entrances, two exits, two everything, then sure, I think you can pull it off. And just having two addresses and a week separation will likely not work.
And that's why I'm saying it's very fact intensive. And you like separated wall, right? So like under the same roof, to me, I mean, like, I'll use an example like and obviously you wouldn't grow in a strip mall, but just to use a simple example of a strip mall, each suite I don't think would be the same facility, but like you couldn't.
No, if it's separate parcels, in my experience, if it's
separate parcels, separate mailing addresses, separate utility bills, all that stuff has to be separate. Now, like, is there advantage in co-locating with people like in an area? Yeah, there can be.
You can share staff. It's pretty normal.
Sharing staff can be complicated, a little bit. Your staff has to go through background checks in Minnesota OCM, but like, you could share potentially process equipment. You could transfer orders between each other. Maybe get some bulk deals on deliveries for certain like soil, nutrients.
There could be benefits to it, and I do think that there are probably ways to pull it off. It's just going to not be super simple. Like for instance, like if you want to get the zoning done on that properly, you're going to have a firewall between those two. Like you can't just have a regular wall. Like you're going to have like a full-on firewall, and so you're going to have to do some work on the building. But I think it could be pulled off. But this is one of those things where you definitely want to like not go in cold on this, and you want to have done a lot of work ahead of time before you even approach the OCM, right? And so, I think it could be done, but it's just going to be nuanced.
Yeah. So those are the questions we got so far. So I just saw those come through. Go ahead and hop back into what we're talking about. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the local retail registration. So this applies to retailers, micro businesses, mezzo businesses, or medical combination businesses, all of which trying to open a retail branch of their business. This is where you get into local control fiefdom, for lack of a better word, and where it can get a little complicated. Another thing I want to point out on the front end is Minnesota is somewhat unique in that, your municipally owned liquor stores can also get into the cannabis business. So you might want to check if you're doing that, because you might have a competitor that is also your regulator in that space. Local retailers are required to be not only licensed but inspected by their local municipality at least once a year. So again, and I come from Louisiana, where we actually we take political corruption as a sense of pride here. So I look at it through that lens, which is, I don't know what I would do if certain local Louisiana towns had a store that they could use to make money, and then I opened a competitor right next to them, and then they got the opportunity to inspect me once a year. That would at least give me some pause, or at least something I would look at and have a conversation with them about them before I spent money. There is they can have a local registration fee. Those fees are capped, I believe. I believe it's half of the annual licensing fee, I think, is the cap, or maybe 500, whichever is lower. So I think it's typically going to be 500 unless it's 250 for micro licenses. But the biggest thing you want to check on is first availability, right? So municipalities, like I said, can lower or limit retails to a maximum number of allowable caps. I think it's no more than one every 12,500.
If they opt to do, I should know this, I apologize, but if they opt to do a community run, city run store, does that count towards the cap?
It does not.
I didn't think it did. I just wanted to make
sure. It does not. Yeah,
it doesn't count towards the
cap.
cap.
We looked at. Yeah, because that would be evil, right? So yeah, it does not. They do have to allow competitors. That doesn't mean they have to be happy.
I mean, officially, as advice, we would say to probably just move away from them.
Depends on the town. I can't say one size fits all on that. Depends. We're talking about a tiny town or a big town, and I have so many questions. This is a new thing, right? I mean, this is Minnesota's doing a lot of first, and this is one of them. And
I also would say
kind of like it.
It depends on your business model too, right? I would venture a guess that the local owned cannabis store is probably going to be very vanilla, for lack of a better word, very standardized. They're probably not going to have a lot of community sponsored events. They're probably not going to have a lot of sales and promotions. They're probably not going to have as much of a hangout space that you can have under a micro license, like a consumption area or those types of stuff that a local business is. One of the businesses I saw be very successful in Mississippi, which was shocking to me because Mississippi can be a very hard market. He had a very well established community hangout center. And the front of the center, it was what I would call a head shop, novelty shop. But he had a guitar center in the back and some video game consoles in the back. And even though he couldn't operate his business there, he had enough of a customer base and a following that came for his social events that even though his dispensary was physically a lot smaller, he was able to transition a lot of his customers over there. And that's probably the kind of competitive advantage you would need to really outcompete a local municipality. Also, while we're on the topic, Minnesota has Native American tribes, right, which are allowed to also operate their different establishments. So they're going to be under different rules and regulations, which may or may not be a competitive advantage to where they're at. So that also is something that I would look at.
Do they have to charge sales tax? Will the tribes be charging sales tax at their retails?
Do they have applicable state tax? I guess is what your real question is, right?
Peter, well, that 15%, isn't it a 15% excise?
They're gonna be burdened with the same sales tax as everyone else. But keep in mind that as a sovereign nation, they don't pay federal taxes, which means that 280E, which is arguably the largest burden over the entire industry, will not be an issue that they face. So gives them a huge competitive advantage from a profitability and a pricing standpoint. And I expect that this is going to be from the policy person in me, that person who likes to study these things is super excited to see what happens with this. The business person in me who thinks about one of my clients setting up across the street from them is feels differently. But not to say, look, I mean, we don't know. There's just so much it's new and it's different. Now, with that said, we have 471C protections that new businesses that are under a certain revenue level can take, and they could ignore 280E as well. And, 3 years ago, I wouldn't have given that advice. Today, in the right circumstance, I absolutely would. So, it's going to be very interesting, but sorry, I just said a lot of words to answer the question. They do pay sales tax.
Yeah. So again, looking at when you're setting up your business, particularly for retail, that is definitely one of the things that I would look at is who your competitors are. Is it the state? Is it the Native Americans? Obviously, look at the limit. look at the local registration requirements, because they can have different applicable requirements for retail, unlike for other businesses. And you can actually have a different method for doing that. There might be like a local application. Those registrations might be issued be a first come, first serve, rolling, or a lottery. Some of those are going on right now. So, if you're not already looking at a property, some of them might be done by the time you actually get around to looking at it. They might be capped and no more. Um, Another thing that I've noticed from looking at the model ordinance is they can adopt, in addition to like all kinds of other stuff, they can adopt limitations between distances between retailers. So that's another thing which we have to look at, and we've seen this in Mississippi. Even if you actually do, it is going on a rolling basis, and there's not a limit. If they have a cap on the distance between the two of it, you might find yourself locked out of all the attractive properties in an area, right? Like if you have to be 1,000 feet away from the nearest retailer, and your downtown area in a city of 70,000 or whatever it is filled with dispensaries, you might not be able to get one moving forward. At least not an attractive one.
But
So
those were good. Those ordinances were designed to help the business owners, because in some of the earlier states that didn't have those ordinances, we ended up with these clusters where, like, because the municipal approval was just for this little area, you'd find 6 or 7 dispensaries in one place. It doesn't help anybody.
yeah, and that is unfortunately what I have seen, and what they still can do in Minnesota in certain instances is, hey, we're going to make this retail overlay, and this is the area where all the retailers are going to be. And I think that's a little bit misguided versus having them somewhat spread out throughout the facility, or throughout the municipality.
My viewpoint on retail site selection has always been, I hear what you just said. You mentioned a few things like downtown, attractive properties, and then Ben, you kind of referenced those clusters that used to happen. Most notorious one, the Green Mile in Denver, as they called it. But in my mind, it's like when we've always been looking at retail spaces, I think the best ones are like not even commercial zones. Like, yes, you have to be commercially zoned, but you don't want to
Yeah.
be in the, you want to count the rooftops of homes, not the rooftops of other businesses. Personal
Right.
opinion. So that's the home run to me, is when you find a, whatever type of commercial space it is that's surrounded by as many residential rooftops as possible.
I'll
Yeah,
touch on our financial models. We should touch on the financial model a
yeah,
little bit. How
that's
we,
exactly what I was going to suggest
yep,
too.
yeah,
So I mean,
because
we look at judging retail properties on tons of different things. There's tons of like data you can get on this too, but like traffic count for people who are going, home and population, demographics, income levels and stuff around your store, and like to Peter's point, people probably aren't leaving their place of work at during lunch and going to grab cannabis on the way during their lunch break. They're going on their way home, they're coming from home or to home, they're going on the weekends. And so all those sorts of things go into it. Pete, I don't know if you want to touch on any other topics from that related to that, but like, measuring how far you away from another store, what are your competitors, how many people are around you as far as who could come, who could be delivered
Yeah,
to.
look, I guess what I'll just say is like high level, there's when you're going to do a financial model for any type of business, particularly retail here, there's a few different ways to approach it. And we've always liked to kind of let the demographics in a more of a market-based approach, is what I would call it, top down would be a better way to say it, right? Where I'm going to try to estimate how many consumers you have in your area. We're going to try to look at the competitive landscape, try and use data to the extent that we can to make a prediction on how many people are buying legally versus illegally. And again, kind of carve the market up and show you what you should be doing, right? Like I'm not going to tell you what your business is going to do. I'm going to tell you what I think it should be doing if you play your cards right. And to me, that's a better approach on modeling than looking at metrics just like pricing and output. Be like, okay, I think
yeah,
I'm going to sell this many units at this price. I prefer to look at it more, like I said, top down, like, well, we think that you could sell this many units if you did a good job. And so that's it's a different way to model.
overproduction.
It's a different way to model, and we do the same approach on production typically, which is again trying to let not the capacity drive us to say, hey, okay, our equipment can produce this many
Hmm.
pens, so this is what we're going to produce, and this is what we're putting on the model. We would take a more of a market-based approach and try and figure out, well, this is how many vape pens we think will be consumed in Minnesota. This is how many people are making vape pens, et cetera, et cetera. Try to work backwards in that way. And it's a big trend that we've been pushing at the firm for the better part of 4 or 5 years, which is responsible vending, responsible production, and working towards what you can sell and not what you can make. And it's a paradigm shift because it's not how people did it for a long time, and it's what's put us in this position of overproduction that we're in today.
Yeah. So one last topic, and then we'll rapid fire a couple other things out. So we got 5 minutes before one. But just another thing to look at when you're selecting your retail site is They do have the ability. There's state law hours you can operate, and then the local jurisdiction can carve a couple hours over those out of those. One of the particular areas is that they can carve out is late night activity, like 9 p.m. to 2 a.m. So if that happens to be part of your business model, like if you're near or trying to locate near a concert venue, music venue, or other like late night activities, before you spend a lot of money on like a piece of real estate you think is attractive, make sure you're not in a local jurisdiction which has carved out those hours where those businesses don't even open until 10 and you have to close at 9. So again, that's just one of those small things you want to look at. Rapid fire a couple other things, then I'll turn it over to Peter to just kind of close us out. But other things to do to prepare, obviously you've got to select your POS system if you're doing retail. Familiarize yourself with Metric. If you haven't never used Metric before, that's the state required seed to sale tracking system. And then for POS systems, be point of sale, there are many systems, and reach out to us if you need help with that. This is something Peter's very familiar with in his expertise, but different systems that can help you operate your point of sale and also work with the state required tracking system. So
and collect the money.
Yeah, there's a lot of different things that go into it, and I guess Peter, I guess I'll small reminder.
You got your 4 reminders.
Yeah, I've got my 4 reminders. A couple of different things is, look, you are now your preliminary approved. Do not change ownership without prior notifications for OCM. There's a process for that. I say that because that's something that can easily happen with capital fundraising, particularly as you look to go from, oh, hey, I have a hope and a prayer, to now I'm trying to actually operate a business. And then obviously, you can't actually start doing anything until you get your full license approval. So with that, now I really will shut up and I'll turn it over to Peter to kind of close us out.
We did get another question too, guys.
Oh, did we? Let me look at this real quick.
I could go either way, I think.
What other restrictions, such as landlord, lenders, or public-owned real estate, could you restrict from leasing property? I'm not sure if I understand. What other restrictions?
They're just asking who can block you, right? Like the landlord could say no.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So
the landlord could say no, I don't want to rent to a marijuana tenant. The town could say no, I guess, to whatever degree they have the ability to for retail.
Public property is probably something I would avoid in general. But obviously federal property, you would have to. I don't know where that would come up, but you might have certain areas that are
like incubators. I was imagining incubators.
Yeah, public property, stuff like that, I would probably avoid.
Some landlords could run into trouble depending upon how the property is financed.
That's true. Like
those conversations, I'd say that often gets overlooked, but this is usually something that happens like 3 years down the road. Like property gets rented, successful dispensary has been set up, and the landlord finds out, oh gosh, I never should have rented you that property because I have an FDIC insured loan. I need you to move. And then a whole, it works.
Yeah, and to touch. Yeah, to touch on what Peter just said, basically that's the landlord's bank, right? The landlord's bank. If he's got a note on the business and then they find out that the end use is cannabis, they might start putting the squeeze to the landlord, who is going to put a squeeze on you.
The landlord usually doesn't tell them, like they don't think they need to, and then they find out later, and that's when the problem
typically happens. What you want to do, and I don't want to be giving legal advice here, but like one things that I have seen be successful is I put in my leases, I make sure that they know what the intended use is. If I'm doing a cannabis business, I make sure that it's very clear, because at least then I've made everyone aware and I've done as much as I can. I believe in being upfront about my intended use, because if there's a problem, I'm trying to draw it to the surface now before I spend money, and not 2 years from now when I've spent untold amount of money operating my business, building out my business, building my customer base, and then suddenly I have to move and incur a bunch of expenses then.
So I think you nailed it there, right? Like it's the landlord, the property owner, it's the town itself, and then beyond that, the neighbors can cause problems too. Usually unsuccessfully, but neighbors can make noise sometimes. We're dealing with that on one right now. But it's going to be fine. It's really just noise, to be honest with you. The project's approved, and so
I have seen community kitchens. You can use community kitchens in order to produce like a confectionery base product and then bring that back to your ranch and then do the infusion. I have seen that done.
Yeah, if you get into a bind. So yeah, I mean, look, you're hitting on the right things. The town and the property owner are your 2 biggest concerns, and so work through those first, and then other opposition will make itself known. Let's see what else I had on my list. So I mean, obviously, look, Minnesota's kind of buzzing with activity right now. They just did the first licensing round. Was it 249 licenses total? Huge step forward. I think the approach is unique. We've kind of talked about that a lot. We've got a mix of lottery-based licenses. We've got some limited permits. You've got tribal inclusion to such a degree that the state has now set a national precedent with White Earth opening up off reservation, what's that in Moorhead. So that's a huge milestone to me for the Native American communities looking at this, albeit it's somewhat intimidating for non-tribal operators. Again, and also, meanwhile, in the middle of all this, the state tax rate, the sales tax rate goes from 10 to 15% overnight. And so that just happened. That shows you that that could reshape the market dynamics before we even launch. We got to go redo all the budgets. And so it's a reminder that this thing is still evolving. Policy changes are coming fast, and that's the same nationally. We're projected to hit 45 billion as a legal industry this year in 2025, up to 50 by 2029. Early forecast in Minnesota for the first year are ranging from 800 million to 1.5 billion. That's the forecast I can find. And so huge range, shows you a lot of uncertainty. I think the state's well positioned. You got 5.7 million people, fairly progressive culture, proximity to states like Wisconsin, North Dakota, Iowa could make you a regional hub for some time. Survey data tells me that the state has a pretty active consumer base. 2024, we saw a survey come out from the OCM, I think it was. Average consumption, 24.8 grams a month. That's a lot more than the national. I think those numbers are skewed, possibly. But you got a long-standing cannabis culture. It was one of the first states to decriminalize back in 76. Um, Even back in 2014, I saw survey data. Minnesota was at 17% admitting to consumption. At that time, nationally, we're at 11.5%.
Yeah, that's high.
I think that's been influenced by, look, you got Canada to the north, first country to federally legalize. Um, I don't know. It's no surprise to me that that's where the public sentiment is going in Minnesota. And in addition to that, you had early exposure to the THC infused beverages, but in normal settings like bars and restaurants, right? That's normalizing this to a degree that only a few places have done. Even if you go to Amsterdam, it's hard to find a place where you can get THC and alcohol in one place. Minnesota's actually already done that. And so that removes a lot of stigma. The sky didn't fall, and so I think the future is bright there, but again, it's moving fast and there's a lot of challenges. So I think that stay the course, and I'm excited personally. And this is, as Jacob mentioned, we actually did even pursue our own license here, which is not something we do everywhere. And so that to me says a lot right there. So guys, any other closing remarks? Did I miss anything?
Yeah, I just thank you all for attending. We really appreciate it. Hopefully this was some useful information for y'all. If there's any other like follow-up questions we have or anything we can do, we're here to help people, and excited about the opportunity in Minnesota. I believe Ben will follow up with everybody, maybe sending out some of the notes from today's meeting, and also just kind of starting a conversation to see if there's anything we can do to help.
Yep, schedule anytime. And then I'm Ben at
Yeah,
bridgewestconsulting.com.
Ben at bridgewestconsulting.com, website bridgewestconsulting.com. Thank you to my partners at BGM for having us on again. Obviously, they're always available as well too to work with you. So thank you to everyone. See you soon.